This daily lesson rewind is for chapter 2, lesson 2, estimating percents. So yesterday we finished up doing the actual finding percents, and if you remember, that's when we were given problems and we could just change percents to decimals, multiply them out, and find what we have. Now in reality, estimating is a much bigger skill than kids realize. A lot of you guys watching this video are used to having to find exact answers, when if you go to the store or if you go anywhere else and you see something that's on sale 20% off, all you have to do is get close. Do I have enough money in my pocket to cover what I'm buying? We don't need to know to the penny necessarily what it is, but can I get it close? So today our goals are what we'll learn: estimate the percent of a number, estimate's the keyword, and then find percents greater than 100 or less than 1. Because those get kind of awkward because for whatever reason, we kind of throw out what we learned and we just assume things are happening. And we want to make sure we're trusting what we know. So let's get started and see what we can find out. First thing we want to discuss is the 10% method. The key to doing these problems mental math is what we call the 10% method. And let's go through real quick and let's look at what we know. If we just break down what we know, I know that 10% has some qualities to it. If I see a percent, the first thing I know is that percents are always out of 100. So I know that I have 10 out of 100 parts possible. I know by reducing fractions that since they both end in a 0, they're both divisible by 10. So if I divide the top and bottom both by 10, I end up with 1/10. Okay? The other thing I know is that multiplying by 1/10 is exactly the same as dividing by 10. If I find 1/10 of 10, 1/10 of 10 looks like this. We put it over 1, and we get 10 over 10. My answer is 1. Or if I take 10 and divide it by 10, any number divided by itself is also 1. So when we say 1/10, it really means we're dividing by 10. Now, let's see why that matters. You might sit there and go, yeah, who cares, Mr. Later? It's kind of a big deal. We're in a base 10 number system. What that means is every time we multiply by 10 or divide by 10, we gain or lose place values. So a simple example, let's just pick a number. Let's say 2,000. If I say 2,000 and I divide by 10, I end up getting 200 because 10 200s fit into 2,000. If I then take my 200 and divide it by 10, I end up getting 20 because 20 10s fit into 200. If I take 20 and divide by 10, I end up with 2 because there are 2 10s in 20. But now, let's look a little deeper. Let's look at what actually just happened. My decimal was here, I divided by 10, and now my decimal's here. So I went from having 4 decimal places, 1, 2, 3, 4, down to only having 3 decimal places. Then I divided by 10, and I ended up with 2 decimal places. Then I divided by 10, here's my decimal, and I ended up with 1. So every time I divide by 10, I lose a decimal place. What does that mean to me? The trick is, every time you divide by 10, you can move your decimal 1 place to the left. And since dividing by 10 is the same as multiplying by 1/10, is the same as 10%, the 10% method simply says this. If we're using the 10% method, 10% of a number, we move our decimal 1 spot to the left. So if I want 10% of 105, I would move my decimal and it'd be 10.5. If I wanted 10% of 200, I would move my decimal 1 spot because I'm really dividing by 10. 10% of 200 is 20 because 10 of them would give me my 200 back. If I wanted 10% of 75, I would move my decimal 1 spot and I would get 7.5. Now I know you're probably thinking, wow, this is a lot. This isn't even in my book. I don't know why we're talking about it. Now let's look at why this is important. This 10% method is important when we get to the mental math part of things. So let's skip over and let's see what we can find out. If we try these, 10% of 20, we're going to move our decimal over 1 spot, and when we move our decimal moves from here to here, so the answer is 2. 10% of 125 divided by 10, we end up with 12.5. 10% of 310, we end up with 31.0. The decimal with a 0 after it does not impact its value, so it's really just 31. Okay? Now let's play. Let's see what we can find out. Jody has paid 62% of $500 she owes on her loan. Estimate 62% of 500. Now first of all, estimate means clean it up if you don't like it. So I look at these two numbers and I say, well, I see a 62 and I see a 500. 500 is a nice clean number. 62, not so much. We have this 2 in here. So I'm going to round 62 down to 60. And we're going to split this screen in half. And let's see what we can do. I have a hard time making perfectly straight lines with this tool, but let's do our best. Here we go. Over here, this is our calculation method. This puts it back into what we did yesterday. So 62% of 500, I'm going to identify by circling which number I'm going to estimate, and I'm going to make it 60% of 500. So I'm just going to rewrite it how I'm estimating it. Now, based on yesterday, for the next step, we said we can change our percent to a decimal. So I'm going to scribble out my percent, make this a decimal, because it's out of 100. Of means multiplication. Now here's my problem. 0.60 times 500. Okay? Now we call it the calculation method because now we just do a bunch of thumb pushing. It's calculators. So we do 0.6 times 500, and we find out that we're going to end up with 300 as our answer. Now, 3 S's for successes. We set up the problem. We solved it. Now state, what does 300 mean? 300 means that she still owes, okay, it says she's paid this, estimate 62% of 500. So the 300 means that she has paid off $500 of her loan and she still owes 200. So we'd say $300 paid off. That's what she's paid off. Okay, that's our calculation menu. Take the new idea today, turn it into yesterday where we're comfortable, and solve. Now here's our M&M method. I call it M&M, mental math. So our M&M method works like this. If I'm trying to find 60% of 500, here's what I do. I know that 10% of 500 is 50. Whoop, I'm sorry. Is $50. 10% is $50 because we move our decimal over one spot. But I don't want 10%, I want 60%. So 6 10% would be 60%. So it only makes sense based on proportions from last chapter that 6 50s would be 60%. So 6 times 5 is 30, so 6 times 50 is 300, and I have it all done. Now the goal for some of you is going to be able to do this without writing anything down. So you would say 10% of 500 is 50. 6 of those 50s would be 300, and hopefully eventually we'll be able to go from here to here without ever having a paper and pencil meet. That would be nice. Alright, let's look at one more and then I'll let you guys work. Next one. It says Marita and 4 of her friends ordered pizza for a bill that cost $14.72. She's responsible for 20% of the bill. About how much money does she need to pay? Now again, let's split the screen in half and let's use calculation method and let's use our mental math method. So over here I've got $14.72. Okay, this is the number I'm going to estimate. So for me, I'm going to keep it easy. I'm going to say that's about 15 bucks because that's what you would do in a restaurant. And if you leave a little extra, good for the waitress you tipped. She'll love you. So $15. And now I need 20% of $15. Notice how I keep all my units and all my labels on these. Now let's go back to yesterday. Let me change it to red so you can see what I should see on your papers. What I should then see is you getting rid of the percent sign and saying 0.20, 20%, the word of means multiplication, times $15. Now we go to our calculator and 0.2 times 15 is $3. So again, 3 S's for successes. We set up the problem, we solved it, now we state that $3 is owed. That's her portion. Okay? Now let's go M&M approach. Mental math. I know that if I'm using, I need 20% of my rounded $15, mental math tells me this. 10% is $1.50 because we moved my decimal one spot over. Well, if 10% is $1.50 and I need 20%, then again, proportional reasoning, If I double the percent, I have to double the result. So 20% must be equal to the $3. Same exact result, two entirely different approaches. Alright? So as you do your homework, make sure at a minimum this is where we're at. So if you're in the mild problems and you're trying to work through and you're not very good with percents and decimals and this is kind of awkward for you and you're not super confident, use our calculation approach. Estimate, round, use your calculators, be confident, get the answer that we need. If you've done a lot of hot problems this year and you're like, I got this, then go to the mental math and try to do it using that 10% method. Alright? Best of luck.